My name is Danielle Foster. I am 34 years old, and the morning I lost the man I thought I would marry was also the morning I realized I had already been erased from the future. We spent 10 years building together. Our wedding was only 6 days away. My dress was hanging carefully in the back seat of Ryan's SUV after my final fitting, and I was still smiling because everything finally felt real. I thought we were driving home to finish the last details before our families arrived for the weekend. Ryan reached across the console and buckled my seatbelt the way he always did. Then he kissed my forehead with the same calm smile that had carried us through years of late nights, unpaid bills, and impossible dreams. I remember thinking he looked unusually relaxed. A second later, he said there was something I needed to know before Saturday because he did not want me hearing it from anyone else. I laughed softly and asked if he was planning another surprise. His answer changed my life before I even had time to breathe. He told me he had married another woman that morning. He said her name was Olivia, and he explained everything with the same steady voice he used during board meetings when investors became nervous. He said she needed certainty. He said she would not continue their relationship without a legal commitment. Then he looked at me and quietly added that nothing important had changed between us, because I would always be the person who truly understood him. I stared through the windshield, waiting for him to smile and admit it was some cruel joke. But he never did. When I finally asked why he would marry someone else less than a week before our wedding, Ryan sighed, as if I were making a simple misunderstanding more difficult than it needed to be. He reminded me that we had already built a life together. He said paper did not define real love. He even suggested we could still hold the ceremony because everything had already been paid for. He said it would be a shame to waste such a beautiful day after all the work I had put into planning it. I realized I was no longer listening to the words. I was listening to the certainty behind them. He truly believed I would accept this because he believed I had nowhere else to go. Min kept walking after Ryan drove away because I knew if I went home right then, I would only hear the same excuses again. Every memory from the past year started replaying in my head, but this time they looked different. Things I had ignored suddenly fit together like pieces from a puzzle I never wanted to solve. It stopped feeling like one terrible decision. It felt like a plan that had been unfolding while I was standing right beside him. For months, Ryan had quietly changed the way he included me in the company we built together. He told me I deserved a slower life after everything we had sacrificed, and said he wanted to carry more of the pressure himself. I believed him because I trusted the man, not the title he held. When board meetings ran late, he encouraged me to stay home instead of sitting through conversations he claimed were routine. I thought he was protecting my peace. Looking back, I realized he was protecting his secrets. Then there was Olivia. Ryan always introduced her as an outside branding consultant who helped prepare investor presentations and public events. I remembered seeing her name appear more and more often in his calendar over the last several months. Whenever I asked how the meetings went, he answered with short, ordinary updates that never sounded suspicious. She was simply another contractor. Another professional helping the company grow. At least that was the story I accepted, because it was easier than questioning the man I planned to marry. The hardest part was remembering all the moments that had seemed too small to matter. Ryan had started making financial decisions without asking my opinion. Documents that once landed in both of our inboxes suddenly stopped arriving in mine. Whenever I offered to review product plans or technical updates, he smiled and reminded me that I had earned a break after years of carrying so much responsibility. I thanked him for thinking about me. Now I wondered whether he had been slowly teaching everyone else to forget I had ever been part of those conversations. By the time I reached my car, I understood something that hurt even more than the affair itself. Olivia was not the beginning of what happened to me. She was only the person who finally made me notice everything else that had already been slipping away. I sat behind the steering wheel without starting the engine and opened my email for the first time in weeks, determined to look at every message I had been too trusting to question. I called Samuel Grant before I talked to anyone else. He had handled the legal work when Ryan and I were still building our company from a borrowed office with mismatched furniture and secondhand computers. We had not spoken much in recent years because Ryan insisted the company already had everything under control. Samuel recognized my voice immediately, and after a brief silence, he asked if something had finally happened. An hour later, I was sitting across from him while he placed several folders on the conference table. He did not ask about Ryan's affair because he seemed to understand there was a larger reason I had come. Instead, he opened the oldest file and turned it toward me. My signature covered nearly every important document from our earliest years. Looking at those pages felt like opening a time capsule from a life I had almost forgotten. Samuel reminded me how we divided responsibilities when the company was only an idea. Ryan became the public face because he could inspire investors and build relationships. I stayed behind the scenes because writing the platform and solving technical problems came naturally to me. Before I stepped away from daily operations, I had granted the company permission to use the software architecture I created under a long-term licensing agreement. I remembered signing those papers because we believed we were protecting the future we would share together. He pointed to one page and calmly explained something Ryan apparently never expected to matter. The licensing agreement was not permanent. It had a fixed expiration date that arrived in less than 1 week. Any extension required my direct approval because the intellectual property had always remained under my ownership. Ryan had spent years acting as though the company itself belonged entirely to him. He had forgotten that the foundation beneath it was never his to give away. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment. Suddenly, every decision Ryan had made over the past year looked different. His confidence no longer seemed to come from love or loyalty. It came from believing I would never read the documents again, never ask questions, and never remember what I had once built with my own hands. When I looked back at Samuel, I simply asked what needed to happen next. He nodded once, closed the folders, and said we would follow every legal step carefully, one document at a time. Ryan called the next afternoon as if nothing permanent had happened between us. He said there was an investor reception that evening and insisted I should still attend because everyone expected to see me there. Before I could refuse, he explained that Olivia would be joining him for the first time at a major company event. Then he asked if I could help her feel comfortable, because I knew all the long-term partners better than anyone else. The request settled over me with a weight that almost made it hard to breathe. When I arrived at the hotel, Ryan greeted Olivia with the warmth he once saved for me. She stood beside him wearing a tailored dress and the quiet confidence of someone who believed she belonged there. Ryan introduced her to guests while describing her as an important part of the company's future. When conversations became more technical, he looked toward me and casually asked if I could explain the history behind certain partnerships, because Olivia was still learning. Every sentence reminded me that he had already decided my role had changed. I spent the evening answering polite questions and shaking familiar hands. Many of the investors smiled when they saw me because they remembered the early years, even if they had not seen me around the office lately. Ryan moved easily through the ballroom with Olivia on his arm, while I quietly filled the gaps whenever someone needed context about the company's past. It felt less like attending an event I helped build and more like introducing someone else to a home where I was no longer welcome. Later that evening, Ryan found me near the entrance between presentations. He thanked me for being mature and said he knew he could always count on me to handle difficult situations without creating unnecessary drama. He believed my silence meant acceptance instead of patience. He believed I was helping him protect the future he had already chosen. I listened without interrupting because there was nothing left to explain between us. As the reception came to an end, I watched Ryan and Olivia leave surrounded by congratulations and confident smiles. They looked exactly like two people convinced the hardest part of their story was already behind them. My phone vibrated once before I walked to my car. It was a short message from Samuel letting me know every required document had been prepared and was ready for the next step. I locked my phone, took one slow breath, and drove home, knowing the future Ryan imagined was about to meet the truth he had ignored for years. The special board meeting began the following afternoon. I walked into the headquarters I had avoided for years. carrying nothing except a leather folder Samuel had prepared for me. Several people looked surprised to see me, but no one asked why I was there. Ryan glanced up from the head of the table and smiled with quiet confidence. He assumed I had finally come to support him after everything that had happened between us. Samuel stood once everyone had taken their seats. His voice remained calm as he explained that he was delivering formal legal notice regarding my ownership rights and the licensing agreement signed during the company's earliest days. One document after another was placed in front of every board member. The room became noticeably quieter as they reached the pages, showing that the core software architecture had always remained my intellectual property. Ryan frowned for the first time since I entered the room. He interrupted before Samuel finished speaking. Ryan insisted the company had operated successfully for years and claimed those agreements were only historical paperwork with no practical effect anymore. Samuel waited for him to finish before pointing to the expiration date printed in plain language. The current license would expire within days, and any renewal required my written approval. Without it, the company would lose the legal right to continue using the technology under the existing terms. Ryan picked up the contract and read the page again, much more slowly than before. The discussion shifted almost immediately. Board members who had remained silent began asking questions about agreements they admitted they had never personally reviewed. Emma Brooks requested copies of every supporting document so the directors could verify the records independently. Another member asked whether recent business decisions had taken these licensing conditions into account. Ryan answered quickly, but his confidence no longer sounded effortless. For the first time, I watched him struggle to control a room that had always responded to his voice. Then Samuel presented another set of documents. They showed that several consulting agreements connected to Olivia's firm had been approved for internal review because they required additional verification under company policy. Olivia's expression changed as she looked toward Ryan instead of the paperwork. He avoided her eyes and focused on the directors around the table. In that moment, I understood something important. Neither of them had expected the truth to arrive in the form of signed documents instead of angry accusations. When the meeting paused, Ryan finally looked directly at me. He asked quietly why I was doing this after everything we had shared together. I met his eyes without raising my voice and reminded him that I was not taking anything away from him. I was only asking everyone in the room to recognize what had belonged to me from the very beginning. The meeting ended with more questions than answers, but that was enough to change everything. The directors agreed that the licensing issue could not be ignored and voted to begin an independent review before making any further decisions. Emma volunteered to coordinate the document requests, so every board member would receive the same information at the same time. Ryan objected, insisting the company could not afford delays while major projects were moving forward. But no one accepted his reassurance as quickly as they had only an hour earlier. The news spread through the executive offices before the afternoon was over. Managers who normally spoke with complete confidence suddenly became careful with every conversation. Investors who had planned routine calls began asking for updates instead. Ryan spent the rest of the day moving from meeting to meeting, trying to convince everyone that the situation was temporary and completely under control. The harder he worked to calm people down, the more obvious it became that control was beginning to slip away. Olivia waited for Ryan outside the conference room after the directors left. She looked confused more than frightened, as if she had just discovered there was an entire chapter of the company's history nobody had ever shared with her. She quietly asked why Danielle's name appeared on documents connected to the technology that powered the business. Ryan answered with the same confidence he always used, saying everything would be resolved once the lawyers finished reviewing the paperwork. She nodded, but I noticed she did not look convinced anymore. I stayed only long enough to complete the formal legal process Samuel had prepared. Every signature was collected exactly as required, and every notice was delivered through the proper channels. There were no raised voices, no dramatic arguments, and no celebration. I had spent too many years building that company to enjoy watching uncertainty spread through its offices. My only goal was to make sure the truth finally stood where assumptions had lived for far too long. Before leaving the building, Emma caught up with me near the elevator. She thanked me for handling everything through official procedures instead of turning the situation into a public fight. I told her the employees deserved stability even if the leadership did not. She gave a small nod before the elevator doors opened. As they closed behind me, I realized Ryan had always believed consequences would arrive as anger. He never imagined they would arrive as quiet paperwork signed in the right order. 3 days later, Ryan asked to meet away from the office. I almost refused, but I wanted to hear what remained once his confidence was gone. We chose the coffee shop where we had celebrated our first contract. He was waiting when I arrived, looking older than a week before. Ryan said the directors wanted answers. Investors were delaying decisions, and Olivia no longer trusted his explanations. He admitted the company needed cooperation before the licensing issue became more serious. Then he reminded me that we had survived worse together and said we could still repair everything if I stood beside him again. I listened because I needed him to finish. When he stopped, I asked whether he wanted to save our relationship or save his position. Ryan lowered his eyes and said both had always been connected. The answer hurt because it made our 10 years sound like another business arrangement. He reached across the table, but I moved my hand before he could touch it. He began talking about our first apartment, the unpaid bills, and the nights we stayed awake planning the company. He said I had always been the steady one, the person who stayed when life became difficult. Then his voice softened, and he admitted he never believed I would leave. He thought I had given too much to start over without him. I told him that was why there was nothing left to repair. My loyalty had been a choice, not a guarantee he could use against me. I did not leave because Olivia was younger or because the company was changing. I left because he decided my love meant I would accept humiliation and return. Ryan sat quietly. There were no angry words, only the truth between two people who could no longer return to what they had been. I stood, thanked him for meeting me, and walked toward the door. This time, he did not ask me to stay. In the weeks that followed, I stopped measuring my life by what Ryan had lost and started measuring it by what I had finally reclaimed. The legal process continued exactly as it should, and the company moved forward under the agreements that had always existed. My role was no longer something hidden behind old memories or private sacrifices. For the first time in years, my work and my name stood together again. One morning, I walked into a small office that would become the home of my next chapter. The room was quiet. The furniture was simple, and nothing about it looked impressive from the outside. It reminded me of the place where Ryan and I had once started with almost nothing except determination. This time I was building without fear that someone else would slowly erase my place in the story. People sometimes ask whether I regret the 10 years I spent with him. The truth is that I do not. Those years taught me how to build a company, trust another person, survive disappointment, and recognize the difference between love and dependence. Losing Ryan was painful, but losing myself would have been far worse. The hardest lesson was realizing that respect cannot survive where gratitude turns into entitlement. Ryan believed my loyalty guaranteed my silence because I had stayed through every difficult season of our lives. He forgot that staying had always been my decision. The day I chose differently was the day his certainty finally disappeared. If you are listening to my story while wondering whether it is too late to start over, I hope you remember this. No relationship should require you to disappear so someone else can feel important. The right future will never ask you to surrender your identity to keep it alive. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story meant something to you, please like, share, and subscribe, and tell me in the comments what part stayed with you the most. Your story deserves the same respect as your heart.